Hey guys, welcome to your first section of Chapter 10. There are 4 sections to this chapter on our study of imperialism. Again, 4 different sections, so you'll have 4 different vodcasts, 4 different sets of notes. Pretty long chapter, but this study of imperialism, we'll get to the definition of imperialism in just a second, but this first section of study, we will be talking about President Grover Cleveland, President William McKinley, the acquisition of Alaska and Hawaii. And we'll also touch on the idea of manifest destiny, that idea that American men, women, and children were destined to move across this continent, replacing light with ignorance of the native civilizations. And very quickly, let's just look at one major aspect of imperialism, and that is the growth, the crazy growth of eyelashes, or eyebrows, as I should say. Look at those things. Holy cow, watch out. If you don't watch out, they'll jump out and grab you. So let's move on before it grabs us. Some objectives, things you should learn by the end of this section. And moving on. All right, getting right into our notes. Manifest destiny, the idea that courageous pioneers believe that America has a divine obligation. Look at that word, obligation. Not a right or not a choice, but an obligation. It's our duty to stretch across the boundaries of this continent, east coast to west coast, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Again, replacing light with darkness, assuming that the Native Americans were less civilized, less intellectual, and it's our duty, it's our obligation to spread that knowledge to them, the knowledge of the American way. Anyhow, we've been studying since the beginning of the year this idea of manifest destiny since colonial days, even though we didn't study that far back. Since colonial days, there's this idea that once we have established this continent, it's our duty to spread across and preach God's word and make this continent productive. American leaders begin to believe that once we have conquered the North American continent with the United States, that we should start looking outside the borders of our country. So manifest destiny applies to within the borders of the United States, east coast to west coast. Imperialism is venturing outside the borders of the United States. The leaders of the country noticed that European leaders, the European countries, were expanding, and they believed that if we were to stay competitive with them, that we should be doing the same. Here's the definition of imperialism. There are 3 reasons, 4 really, but 3 that gets us into why the United States got involved in imperialism. Number 1, global competition. First reason. Again, we were watching other European nations. We were watching other countries like England and France and Germany expand their empire. We believed that if we were to stay competitive, we had to do the same. A lot of countries get involved in China. We'll talk in section 4 more about China. But number 1 reason for global competition. 2, military strength. Now that we have conquered our continent, we have quite a bit of land area to defend. The only way to do that is to protect our borders. Military strength. And the leaders of the military saw our biggest area that we were deficient in was in our Navy. So at the urging of Alfred T. Mahan, let me write that name down, at the urging of Alfred T. Mahan, the United States Congress set aside money to build up our Navy. We built 9 steel-hulled cruisers. We learned in the last semester how steel was becoming a major product for building skyscrapers, bridges, rail lines. Well, now it's being used to build ships. After the building of these 9 steel-hulled ships, the United States becomes the 3rd largest naval power in the world, behind England and I want to say Spain. These 9 new ships are given the title the Great White Fleet. Called the Great White Fleet because their hull was painted white to give them this dazzling look as the sun reflected off their bodies. A third reason for the United States to become imperialistic was a thirst for new markets. Now, we have talked in the first chapter how farmers were growing crops and the crop prices were so low they were not making money. So one way to counteract that, farmers bought more land and they grew more crops. They thought if they grew more they could sell more, make more money, or at least break even. The only thing that did, as we learned, was put more supply on the market. The demand didn't increase. So we have this enormous amount of crops just sitting there. No one can buy it. So we need a place to sell it, or it's just going to rot and go to waste. The same thing happened in industry. We were producing so much that we reached a point of saturation. We couldn't sell anymore. For example, the Pullman cars. There's only so many sleeper cars a railroad company can buy. Well, Pullman experienced that firsthand. People stopped buying his cars because they had all they needed, and the railroad transportation was declining. So the railroad companies were not buying Pullman cars. So we have this surplus in our agriculture, we have surplus in industry, and we have no one to sell it to. So we start looking outside the country, outside the borders of our United States, for a new market, for new people to sell to. And to continue our production, the United States needed raw materials. In our factories, raw materials are coal and iron and wood. So we start looking for raw materials. So we trade our surplus agriculture, trade our surplus industry for raw materials. So everything should balance out in theory. Americans at one point were hesitant to venture out. We didn't want to get involved in European affairs, but as they see the benefit to expanding our markets overseas, a lot of Americans warm up to the idea. That's what that phrase means. They start getting used to it. They start to accept it, and they see that if we establish trade partnerships with foreign countries, that might increase our employment rate, or decrease unemployment. More people would have jobs, and we've talked about that before in class, how job growth kicks in your economy. This would be number 4, the fourth reason, if you wanted to call it a reason for imperialism. I'm less inclined to call it a reason and more of a justification for what we did. This belief in cultural superiority, this belief that Anglo-Saxons were superior. Earlier on we talked about, or I mentioned, the definition of manifest destiny. It was our duty, our obligation to spread the light to these savages, these natives, the dark civilizations, if you will. Well, this idea of Anglo-Saxon superiority is at the heart of all of that, this cultural superiority. The Anglo-Saxons, and we'll talk in class about the origin of Anglo-Saxon race, but this idea that the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants were superior to other countries drove this idea of imperialism for America, and the same idea applies to manifest destiny. If it was our duty, our obligation to Christianize and civilize the heathen savages on our continent, then why would God not want us to do the same thing to the savages worldwide? Again, Americans start to believe in that idea, and everything that I just mentioned there. Now, there are 3 situations prior to 1900 where the United States practiced this theory of imperialism before the United States became officially imperialistic. The time period we're talking about right now is 1880, 1890, but there are 3 things that happened prior to that time before we really ventured out. The first was Japan around the 1850s. We sent a fleet, I don't even know what you would call it, a mission to Japan to see if they would be willing to trade with us to establish a partnership. Japan had no interest, so we encouraged them with a little bit of military force. And since that time, up until the 1900s and beyond, we traded with Japan, but we forced them. That comes to be very important when we get into World War II. The second we'll talk about here is Alaska. The United States acquires Alaska, and it's pre-Civil War. Very, very important. Secretary of State William Seward ventures up to Alaska, talks to the people who own Alaska, which is the Russians. They were interested in selling Alaska for three reasons. Russia was experiencing some economic problems, so they needed the money. The size of Alaska was so big it was almost impossible to defend, and it was so far from the main capital of Russia that it was almost impossible to do any positive thing with Alaska. There was just no reason for Russia to have it in the minds of the Russian leaders at that time. So they were willing to sell Alaska to the United States for the amazing low price of $7.2 million total. Now that is, I don't know, something like 2 cents an acre. Yeah, we got the Louisiana Purchase for 4 cents an acre. The size of Alaska compared to the Louisiana Purchase is 3 times as large. So the size that we got for the price that we were given is just incredible. A lot of people in the United States at the time were very hesitant for this purchase. You can see here they called it Seward's Icebox or Seward's Folly. A folly is a term that's usually referred to as a joke. Sometimes Siegfried Follies were a big play. It was basically a comedy on stage. So when they were calling this purchase of Alaska Seward's Folly, they said you're just wasting $7.2 million. Another reason people were hesitant is right here, 1867. And this goes back to our study in the first semester. What was going on in 1867? Well, Reconstruction. That's what that says right there, Reconstruction. Why would we want to spend $7 million on a piece of ice when we could use it to help the freedmen, when we could help to rebuild the South? Why? What's the reasoning behind that? People didn't understand what Congress was doing. Imagine that. People don't understand what the government does. But anyhow, Lincoln gave the go-ahead. It wasn't Lincoln, because Lincoln had a little bit of lead poisoning problem, but Johnson gave the go-ahead. Congress gave the go-ahead to go ahead and purchase Alaska. And so it becomes United States territory. And number 3, first Japan, second Hawaii, or Alaska, third Hawaii. And this becomes the major focus of this section, the purchase of Hawaii. Well, I take that back. The taking of Hawaii, and right there it says the taking of Hawaii. We didn't purchase it. Nope. First, 1867 was a busy year for land acquisition for the United States. The United States just simply took the Midway Islands. They are 1,300 miles north of Hawaii. No one was using them. It did not attract any kind of worldwide attention because most people didn't know they were there. Most people thought they were pointless, just a series of islands, no reason. Today, they are still part of the United States territory, and they are inhabited by less than 50 people at any one time. It's a tourist vacation. You can go there for a short period of time. No one lives there. Even the people who work on the island don't live there for a long period of time, 3 months, and then they're back in the mainland. That's because it's so far from the mainland. To get supplies there on a consistent basis is just impossible, and it's not cost effective. But the taking of the Midway Islands was inconsequential. No results, no ramifications from it at all. But it is close to Hawaii, and that's what leads the United States to Hawaii. So the first step in imperialism is to send missionaries. Not really the first step, but that's the first thing that happens in the case of Hawaii. We send missionaries to Hawaii. Why? Because it's our duty to Christianize the heathen savages of the world. I keep saying that in a sarcastic tone. You have to understand, and I've made this point in class before, you have to understand that we are studying history from the perspective of it's already happened. We have the luxury of looking back and say, well, that was stupid. Why'd you do that? It's called 20/20 vision. Hindsight. You look back on things that you've done in the past, and you're like, I shouldn't have done that. At the time, the decision was made because that's how things were done. You cannot study history with the thinking of today's thinking. You have to study history understanding what they were thinking at the time. And this was how things were done. Today it would be impossible and completely inappropriate to do what we have done today. Do it today like they've done it back then. And that's why the United States is involved in so many things worldwide, because things just aren't done that way today. Back then, that's how everyone did it, and that's what the United States is trying to keep up with the world. Those missionaries stay, they get married, they have families, and those children grow up, and those children get involved in the sugar business. Hawaii is really known for its sugar trade. Now, the United States also has its own sugar plants growing in the United States. This is not a major crop, but it's still possible. We were also getting sugar from Cuba. But Hawaii is most important right now. We'll get into Cuba in section 2. The children grow up to be those sugar planters, those sugar growers in Hawaii, and they ask for the United States to annex the islands of Hawaii, make them part of the United States. Here's why. Tariffs. Hawaiian sugar, since Hawaii was a foreign country, if the Hawaiian sugar growers, even though they were American, since they're growing sugar in a foreign country, they had to pay a tariff or a tax on the imported sugar into America. These American sugar planters want the United States to annex Hawaii so that it would become an American territory, thus eliminating the tariff. And what that means is more profit, more money in the sugar growers' pockets. McKinley, as a senator, writes the McKinley Tariff Act, essentially creating a duty-free or a tax-free import of Hawaiian sugar. And the Hawaiian sugar growers were ecstatic about that. They were very happy about that. American sugar growers, not so happy, but again, American sugar growers, not a major crop, so there wasn't a lot of flashback from the American sugar growers. Everything I just said right there, number 4. As the sugar business grows, and with the success of the McKinley tariff, more sugar is coming into the United States from Hawaii. The Americans in Hawaii ask for military protection. In the event that something should happen, nothing has happened, but in the event that something should happen, we would like to have some, the American sugar growers would like to have some military protection. And because it's American-owned businesses in Hawaii, Congress is more inclined to protect their investments. One of the reasons for the growing military strength is to protect American investments overseas. Well, this is one example of that. So, the United States government asks Hawaii if we can build a naval base at Pearl Harbor. The king is not inclined to allow it because he sees it as not necessarily an invasion, but an impeding of foreign power on his land. The power that the American sugar growers in Hawaii held was immense. I think you saw the statistic, and if not, I'll go back. The statistic that immigrant workers, that would be the United States, outnumber Hawaiians 3-1. The power of these sugar growers was incredible. When the king is inclined to decline Americans' request to build a naval site on the island of Pearl Harbor, or at Pearl Harbor, the sugar growers get together, the businessmen get together, and they sit down and talk with the king, and they influence the king to allow this naval base to be built. While they're at this talk with the king, they encourage the king to change the Hawaiian constitution. In history, this becomes known, wow, can't spell today. How about if I change colors while I'm at it? This changing of the Constitution by the King of Hawaii under the influence of American sugar growers in Hawaii becomes known as the Bayonet Constitution. For those of you who don't know what a bayonet is, it's that little piece of sharp metal that sticks out the end of a rifle that's attached at the end of the rifle, usually used for hand-to-hand combat. So a bayonet constitution refers to the fact that the King of Hawaii was forced, basically, under the threat of his own life, to change the Constitution of Hawaii. Not by its Hawaiian people, but by American business owners. So while they're changing the Constitution, one major impact of this change is the voting rights of Native Hawaiians and of the immigrants. The Constitution now states that the only people who can vote are wealthy, landowning males. Sound familiar? It should, because that's who could vote in the United States. White, adult, landowning, educated males. Now that was before the 15th Amendment. All right, so again, before the 15th Amendment, that white adult landowning male stipulation in the United States was how men voted in at the time, and so they apply that to Hawaii. Wow, look at there. That goes on for about 4 years. The king eventually dies. His sister takes over power in Hawaii. Sister's name is Queen Liliuokalani. We'll see a picture of her in her book. We'll talk a little bit about her in her book. Maybe do a DBQ. Who knows? But we'll talk a little bit about her. She is just as, actually, she's probably more forceful than the brother, even though the brother was forced to do things at gunpoint or at bayonet point. That's not erasing. Anyhow, she takes over. She wants to restore Hawaii to its original state. Her motto, Hawaii for Hawaiians. And this gets the sugar growers, the American business growers in American sugar growers in Hawaii, kind of nervous. And so they watch her and make sure that power is not going to be taken out of their hands. She also wants to restore the Constitution back to its original state by removing the property owning stipulation from voting requirements. And instantly this sends a shockwave through the American sugar growers. And they take action to stop this. The king did allow the United States to build a military base at Pearl Harbor, and that's up and running. So when the Queen makes her declaration of restoring the voting rights to all Hawaiians regardless of property ownership, the United States, or the American growers in Hawaii, stage this rebellion. And we'll talk about it in class, but essentially the American sugar growers ask for the help of the United States Marines to come in and stop this rebellion, and they use the excuse that the American economic interests are being hurt, are being destroyed. The sugar plants, the sugar crops, the sugar fields are going to be destroyed if this rebellion is allowed to occur. So the Marines come in and they hold the Queen hostage essentially until things calm down. The Queen gives in. She calls off the rebellion, even though she did not start it, nor did the Native Hawaiians start it. She voluntarily steps down to save any kind of Hawaiian civilian life, to prevent any kind of death to any Hawaiian. She steps down. Sanford Dole assumes leadership. The name Dole should sound familiar to you. Dole fruit is a well-known brand in the United States. Now, Sanford Dole is not the creator or the founder of the Dole Fruit Company. His cousin is, but his cousin is in Hawaii because of Sanford Dole and because of what the United States or the American sugar growers have done in Hawaii. At the time of all this taking place, President Cleveland is the President of the United States. He orders the American sugar growers, the American businessmen, to restore the Queen to power. And he says he will only honor annexation if the majority of Hawaiians support it. Now here's where the voting requirement becomes important. The king rewrote the Constitution to give voting power only to adult landowning males. The Queen threatened to take that away. It never happened because the rebellion was staged. So the bayonet Constitution is still in place. Cleveland's admission of recognizing Hawaii and honoring their request for annexation is moot. There's no reason, no point behind it. He says he will only annex Hawaii if a majority of Hawaiians support it. Well, the only way you'll know if the majority of Hawaiians support it is through a vote. and the majority of Hawaiians can't vote because the Constitution says only landowning people can vote. So Hawaii's not going to be annexed, and Cleveland knew that. He knew that that would not happen because of the new Constitution. So Cleveland washes his hands of annexing Hawaii because of what the American businessmen in Hawaii have done. Cleveland's term ends. McKinley's elected in 1897. He favors annexation. Obviously, he favors annexation because he wrote the McKinley Tariff Act, allowing Hawaiian sugar to be imported into the United States tax-free. So now that he's president, he supports annexation. He gets Congress to support annexation. Hawaii's annexed as an American territory in 1898. No Hawaiian ever had a chance to vote against annexation. Finally, in 1959, it becomes the 50th state. That is the end of Section 1. I apologize for length, almost 26 minutes. Again, watch it at your leisure. Rewatch it as you need to for quizzes and such for the big test at the end, the unit test. If you have any questions, use the I Want to Know form and send them to me. See you later.